Good evening. I'm here with Ravi Agarwal, the curator of the exhibition New Nature's A Terrible Beauty is Born. Ravi, I'd like to begin with asking you about how the show came about, like how it was conceptualized, and the larger collaboration that you have ongoing with the Goethe-Institut, which this exhibition is a part of.
The exhibition, the ideas on the exhibition actually have a few years in the making. It was part of my work as an environmental activist, but also the debates on the idea of the Anthropocene, which started with the Hackaway in Berlin in 2016, that we started thinking about what does this ecological emergency mean? Everybody talks of climate change, species extraction, etc. 2018, Goethe-Institut invited me to curate a conference, a multidisciplinary conference, which had then followed by a number of talks, and then it led to this exhibition, which is sort of in the state of nature framework, one of the final events. It was meant to happen last year, but as we know, COVID, which is very much part of state of nature, then here we are with this. And here we have different artistic positions here and in the adjoining museum. The idea is that we imagine what nature is. And the complexity is that nature is not one thing. It's many things. Depends on who you are and how you see, but it's part of our lives. And these artistic positions are an attempt to show that. And also from a South Asian perspective, because nature is very differently constructed in Europe and it's very differently constructed here. So it's also what we want to say to the world, that this is the political and the ecological process we are inheriting. This is the colonial, post-colonial process we have become part of. And this is our view of nature. So it's a two-way process of contesting and interrogating and expanding this idea of the Anthropocene movement.
Picking up from what you said, one is about how, as humans, we relate to nature, but also extending that to the region in South Asia and how that differs. Because I think either we end up looking at the Anthropocene as large, but so much of it is contextualized in the local. Perhaps you could walk through some of the works and maybe begin with Karan Shrestha, whose work is around Chitwan and
so the idea of the local is very critical in the way we imagine nature. See, because nature is now done the UN conferences, but when you think of local, you're thinking of nature democracy or earth democracy. And what does that mean? So here's this the ongoing engagement by Karan Shrestha, a relatively young artist, with a multidisciplinary project. Mediums he uses film, photography, he uses sculpture, and his fantastic pen in drawing. We look at his drawing, we see the complex landscapes of interrelated species, local people, forests and nature which he builds in this place. And it's interesting because he belongs there. He belongs in one of the communities of the Chitwan Park, and he's really telling the story of what's happening in his, from where he comes from. And in the film you see a lot of references to indigenous knowledge systems, to local cultures, to local dance movements, etc., which all are signified with great meaning and helps us think that what does nature mean here, as different from in Mumbai where we're standing, where we are next to the sea, but we don't even notice the sea in a sense. We are sort of in our own world. But here you cannot afford to do that. This is what nature means for most people.
I'm also taking what you said about Karan working with his history and communities from the region that he's from. Maybe you can shift to Rajshree's work, because she's gone into Dalit histories, gone into her own family archives, but also looked at a different medium where it's not only looking at archives but also looking at exploring and pushing boundaries of the medium itself.
Rajshree's work is actually very critical to this show because she is, as you can see, a wonderful ceramist. Her work here is talking about different food cultures from the community, the Dalit community she comes from, and how these food cultures are how what you eat, how you cook is part of the relationship with nature. So nature and food is a very critical component. But it's also very important to talk about Rajshree's work, because Rajshree, the idea of caste nature, which is relatively newly being spoken about by scholars like Mukul Sharma, that depends on who you are in society, your relationship with nature changes. It says that nature is not out there, it's produced. There's nothing called nature, everybody produces their own idea of nature as a political and ecological being. So, besides the great skill and art in this work, it's the position which she represents, which is one of the key positions in that whole show as an artistic position. And it's really interesting when artists hold positions, because they help us think through with books don't, because they make us feel and sense something. There's an affective way in which it interacts. And that's why I think art is so important when we reconceive and reconceptualize something.
And what you said about how we rethink things and rather than looking at books, from Rajshree, we could maybe move to Parag's work, where he's also been looking at his community archives, looking at histories that he's been collecting, but also what it's meant for him to convert these into sculptures, to go back into his detailed drawings. We can move into that then.
Yeah. So Parag, as you know, Parag comes from the Koli community, which is a fishing community. And it's a traditional, very old community, multi-generational involvement in fishing. But today they've been displaced from the coastlines of Mumbai, as Mumbai is becoming more and more westernized urbanized in a western kind of sense. So he's very engaged, and he's a trained artist in Baroda. He's very engaged in expressing what is being lost. And he also has another project in the Joining Museum where we are showing about his ongoing archive of the community. Now, it's very important for me as a curator to have positions which come from within the community. That these are artists who belong, nobody is representing them. They are from inside. And I think that's a very important way in which they represent themselves. So what they're saying is a deep understanding of what they're feeling and doing. And here you see is mock sculptures with brass and termite and mud. Adjoining, you see these sculptures made from abandoned crabs, because the crabs have gone away because of ecological change, and he's then put these materials in them, and then they hardened and created these sculptures. So they're showing us inside of the. And here you see is very intricate engagement with drawings of local his local environments. But also in the archive, you will see his community with his drawing on fish, his photographs, his bringing on the songs and the poetry. And tomorrow we have a program where two of the Koli poets will come and sing. So these are embedded positions. And I think it's politically very important that we have positions from within the community rather than somebody else showing us. And it's also a comment on today's emerging art in South Asia, that where are the artists coming from? They're coming from all these important spaces, and you would imagine that they will want an economic livelihood, but they will choose to be artists, which we all know is not easy to be in India, because who's going to support you? But they choose to be artists because they're artists at heart. And look what they tell us about what's happening. Go to nature and to the community.
And something I will pick up on, which takes on another dimension of what's happening in the exhibition, is this element of mystery, but also this discovery that where every time we think we know something, it partly comes from the underwater and then goes to the skies, which is what Rohini Devashra works on, where it's still exploring these new forms, it's still acknowledging the fact that there's so much research that we still have left in this. So maybe we can move into Rohini's work.
It's very interesting what you point out, the idea of scale and the multiple scales in inhabit the world. And Rohini does it in her work. Her work here is talking of diatoms and the microscopic organisms. But as we know, Rohini is also an amateur astronomer, so she looks at the skies and the cosmos as well. And she brings them into this very intricate feedback loop drawings and shapes, which are enthralling to look at. And it revealed to us a world that is partly imaginary, but could also be true, in a sense, but also based on what is really happening there. And for me, it's important to show Rohini's work because she's talking about the idea of the multi-species world. So it's not only about the human world, which is in great peril. What's happening to the other species which cohabit with us, but not only cohabit with us, but we know from new research that we have evolved with them. They are part of us. They're in our guts. They're in our cells. Without them, we won't be here today. And some scholars, some scientists say that we won't be able to reproduce without things like viruses. So it's not a demonic world out there. It's a world we have come to inhabit and come to form. And when we think of the future, we have to think of the whole world together, not only the human world. And as you know, one of the key things in the ecological debates is to decenter the human. It's like how to decolonize nature, And I think that's a very important part of what the future could look like.
And perhaps with that we can move to Prabhakar's works, where there's this hybridization in a way of man and nature, and sort of draws you back into this element of looking and questioning what we are looking at.
And Prabhakar, all these artists are very close to my heart because they're extraordinary artists. And Prabhakar, comes from a coal miners family, and he's of course done extremely well for himself internationally. He's fantastic with his hands. He draws freehand. These sort of morphed, almost surreal creatures, but they all have different meanings. Now, these sculptures actually, which he's never shown before, I almost begged him to show them, and he finally agreed because he was hesitant. They're wonderful little things of how we coexist. These are coexistence sculptures. So you see human hand with cities. You see this ant termite hand with humans. So these are things of what I'm saying about how we've co-formed and coexisted and come to be. And these three sculptures actually embody that kind of thought. Besides, they're just beautiful pieces on their own. Yeah.
And through this, maybe we can end looking at Arun Kumar and Himali's work. Because Arun Kumar also visually, when we look at the exhibition itself, it's how this almost in a way divides the two spaces, but also acts as a link between the two.
Arun Kumar is another extraordinary example of a trained, highly skilled, highly accomplished artist, a sculptor who has gone back to his village and created the Sara Center, where he's trying to revive old traditional practices, and he sees the way in which farming communities are being destroyed. And so a lot of his work is actually deeply rooted in his own experience of where he comes from. And I really like that thought of this authenticity of the artist. This particular work he's created with, everything else in recycled wood, but you can see that smattering of local materials, local grains, but also images of farmers. And in the museum there's a beautiful, tall man. He's made of recycled wood, as his practice is, and it's got such a presence. So again, an artist, extraordinary artist who is also deeply rooted. And in a sense, all these artists are interested in the question of ecology in a very rooted way. And they can all they don't have to do this, they can only do the market. They're all successful artists, but they choose to do this. So I think this is about the ethics and the feeling of responsibility of artistic practice, which is also very important with the question of looking up nature tomorrow. And we can move on to Himali's work, Himali Singh Sohi, who comes from a mountaineering family. Her father was he's a very well-known mountaineer, and this particular work is reimagining what this device which was lost on the Nanda Devi in the 80s, the radioactive device, and is telling the story of the landscape from the as Nanda Devi was, the great mountain was telling it. And it's looking at both sides of China and India. So it's talking about both political border, but from the perspective of the mountain. And she's also here created these wonderful nagaras, which were made by the local community, and she normally does a performance here. And these are texts from the performance. Again, an engagement with this question of ecology, which is very key. And this is the, many of these artists are very young artists compared to, they are still, they are young, I mean, they're 30s and 40s. But they have embraced this idea of trying to make a difference in the world. And I think that's really important to see that how artists can do what nobody else can do.
And what's beautiful, I think, is also how this extends into this narrative or storytelling in some way, where what art can do is, in addition to understanding facts, in addition to understanding the world we are in, it also allows us to move into this realm of attaching ourselves to these stories.
Absolutely. How do we tell the story of the world differently than what we have come to be? And these are different stories we tell. That's beautifully put. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ravi. And thank you all for joining us to live. And this will be available as well on the ASAP app.